right, so it is about noon. Steve, am I good to go? I see him shaking his head, so I'm just
Yeah, yes, you're all
How
set,
about it?
Belle. Thanks.
all right. So first, just a couple of norms. I think when you automatically pop onto Zoom, your um, microphone is automatically muted. I know that banjo players are notorious noodlers, and if you're a noodler, that's great. Noodle on. But just make sure that your mic remains muted so that we don't hear 15 to 20 banjo players all noodling at the same time. You can imagine what a cacophony that would be. Secondly, as they mentioned, if you do have a question, go ahead and pop it in the chat. And to get to the chat, if you just kind of move your cursor, if you're on a laptop or a PC, you'll see a little chat bubble down in the middle of the bottom of the screen. If you click on that, a window will pop up and you'll be able to post some questions there. I won't necessarily be able to see them right away, but our host will be able to see it, so they can kind of convey any questions to me. I would ask that we hold off on a lot of the questions to the very end. That way we can make sure we get through the whole presentation. So those are just a couple of quick norms. In the meantime, I do have my chat window open for the moment because I do want to ask you all a question. If you wouldn't mind opening your chat window and just kind of tell me what level you're at, what skill level you're at in your banjo journey. Are you a beginner? Do you consider yourself intermediate? Do you consider yourself advanced? So if you wouldn't mind opening your chat and just letting me know kind of where you are, and that'll also let me know kind of what direction to take our presentation today. So go ahead and type in our chat what level you're at. So I see from Ken, intermediate, guitar and mandolin also, awesome. Beginner, okay, great. Intermediate, all right. Just shy of intermediate, okay. Good, well that already gives me a good starting point. So before we talk about the history, let's go ahead and just play just the basic bum ditty just to kind of get a starting point for some of the background that we're going to need to learn about the history of the instrument. And if you're just a raw beginner starting from zero, this is going to be a good place to start. It might feel a little bit confusing because the timing of the banjo is all about syncopation, especially the clawhammer banjo. If you're intermediate, this will be something that's pretty familiar to you. If you're advanced, you're going to be bored for just a second. But just starting with the basic bum ditty. And in this case, I'm starting out with a pretty standard tuning in clawhammer banjo. This is double C tuning, where I've got my fifth string tuned to a G, and then going from there we've got C, G again, C, and then D. And again, that's a pretty standard tuning. It allows you to capo up to D if you want to play a lot of the fiddle tunes and things like the Albuquerque Folk Festival, for example. But for now, go ahead and just form your C chord, which if you're a beginner, this is going to be on your second fret on your first string. And watch real close on my right hand how this form works. What you do is you kind of make an L with your hand. You're going to form a claw. This is kind of the claw of the claw hammer. And you're going to hammer it down lightly, not real heavy, but you come down on it on one of your four, not your fifth string, but one of your four strings. So it can really be on any of them, or you can brush all of them. And then you're going to go out with your thumb, letting the gravity of your stroke land your thumb on the fifth string, and then go out. And then what you have is called the bum ditty, which is going to be bum ditty, bum ditty, bum ditty, bum ditty, 1, 2, and 1, 2, and 1, 2, and 1, 2, and. Now, if you want to complicate it a little bit, add a little bit of butter to the bread and butter of clawhammer banjo. You can do something called drop thumb, which is going to be dropping that thumb from the fifth string down to one of the other strings. I really like going to the second string when I do drop thumb. So when you're doing that, it's going to sound more like this. Bum, diddy, bum, diddy, bum. Here's the drop thumb. And So that's the basic style that you need to know to understand Clawhammer, but also to understand the history of Clawhammer. So let me go ahead and present my screen to you all. Hopefully I've got everything set up on my end. Can everybody see my screen? Let me open up my presentation. And because I can't hear you, go ahead and give me a thumbs up in the video if you can kind of see my screen. It should say something along the lines of, when it pops up for us in a moment, Music and History of Clawhammer Banjo. Give me a thumbs up if you can see that. All right, I see several thumbs, so we're good. So we're going to start with the origins of Clawhammer Banjo. Many of you probably already know this. A lot of people credit Africa for the banjo, and correctly so. But we're going to drill down a little bit more specifically to the exact region where we believe the Clawhammer Banjo and the banjo itself was born. And that's going to be a country called Senegal. And Senegal is the westernmost country in all of Africa. It kind of comes to a little point where the capital of Senegal is, and the capital is called Dakar. But if you look over at the map that I have on the right-hand side of your screen, you see a purple region called Casamance. And there's a people group down in Casamance called the Jola people. And the Jola people have come up with an instrument that they call the Akonting. Now you can see in the picture what the Akonting looks like. I've also got my Akonting here. And you'll see right away some similarities between the Akonting and the banjo. You've got a skin head, you've got a bridge, and in this case you've got a high drone string up on top. Now I've got a couple videos to show you of the Jola people in southern Senegal playing the Akonting, and pay real close attention to both of their hands as they're playing. So let me move over and play you some of this. If it'll let me.
Alors ça devient encore la
So I'll pause in there. Did everybody see what he's got going on with his right hand? And by the way, give me a thumbs up if you could hear the audio from the video as well, just to make sure. Awesome. So if you notice with his right hand, you have a lot of that very same style that you saw with the clawhammer. He's got his pointer finger clawed. He's hammering down on the strings and plucking it with his thumb. And you also saw a lot of that drop thumb technique. Let's go check out another player. And again, focus in on his hands and how he's playing, but also watch his left hand and look for how he's playing the melody on the Akonting.
This song is about Gambia, composed by my father to tell both Gambians and Senegalese that we are all one. When we meet, we should greet each other, talk nicely to each other, and remember that we are one people, collective personality, not different people. And it's called Gambia or Senegal.
pause him there. So if you noticed on his left hand, he's playing the melody of the song entirely on one string, with the exception, of course, of doing the thumb. So as far as what you would call your fretting hand or playing on, I mean, there's not really a fretboard. It's literally a stick with some fishing line tied onto it. But with your fretting hand, you're only pushing down on one string, and that's going to be your first string or your long string. Now tuck that in the back of your head if you're a clawhammer banjo player, because this is going to be where things start to get a little bit interesting for our playing and what this might mean historically for us as clawhammer players as well. So again, tuck that in the back of your mind. We'll come back to that. So why is the Akonting considered the grandfather of the banjo? Well, again, we've got that tacked on. If you can see my screen and my video as well, we've got that tacked on animal skin head, like on my Akonting here as well. Animal skin being, of course, kind of a preferred medium for the head on a lot of clawhammer banjos. If you haven't tried it, I highly recommend it. There's a guy named John Balch that makes goat skin banjo heads that I can refer you to through Facebook. You can order some beautiful stuff through him. They sound amazing. So you got an animal skin head. You've got, in this case, a gourd rim or a gourd pot. You've got your three strings, including the high drone string, played with the thumb, just like you do in clawhammer banjo. One thing, though, that's kind of interesting, and this is going to be another thing to tuck in the back of your head as we get deeper into some of the more advanced tunings of clawhammer, is on the Akonting, the strings are tuned in a 5, 1, and 7 pattern. In other words, if the 1 or your root note is a G, then your 5 is going to be the D, and your 7 is going to be an F. So altogether, you get a really interesting, almost kind of dark and haunting tone to this instrument. And again, tuck that in the back of your mind. That's going to be important as we get into different tunings. We also learned through the videos that most melody notes on the Akonting are played on the first string, and you've got highly syncopated rhythms, especially that first guy. That guy was syncopating stuff all over the place. And if you've ever had the opportunity to travel to Africa, the music is unbelievably syncopated beyond my realms of comprehension for sure. And these guys can hold it together in amazing ways. So I guess the next question historically is, how does the banjo move from the Akonting to something closer to what we have today in our hands, hopefully right now? Well, really our first references to the banjo in American history come from around the 1780s and 1790s in two different forms. One is a painting that I've had on the background of my presentation and is now in the foreground as well, of a painting called The Old Plantation. Now, this painting dates from around 1790, comes from South Carolina. We don't know who the artist is. It's possible that the plantation owner is the artist, but if you notice, there's a guy playing the banjo down in the corner. Now we'll zoom in on that banjo in just a second and see some of the similarities with the Akonting and some similarities with our modern day banjo as well. But before we get there, one other thing that is a pretty famous reference to the early banjos in American history actually comes from Thomas Jefferson and is from the state of Virginia. And there's definitely a little bit of element of race and racism possibly to this as well. So we got to understand the cultural history, the cultural context of what he's saying as a person who owned enslaved Africans, owned in quotation marks, of course. He says, "The instrument proper to them is the banjar, which they brought hither from Africa, and is the original of the guitar, its chords being the 4 lower chords of the guitar." Now, this is probably a little bit confusing because, well, to me, when I read this, I can tell that Thomas Jefferson probably never tried to play the banjo because he's calling the strings chords, or if he's not calling the strings chords, he's saying the chords are the same, which they might be, but we don't know the tuning of the instrument at the time. We don't know the tuning of the guitar at the time necessarily that he's referencing. So this doesn't really give us a whole lot of context except for when you compare it to the Akonting. So that being the case, let's zoom in on our banjo player. What we have is 4 strings, and this coincides with Thomas Jefferson's contemporary analysis of the banjo at this time as well. We've got 4 strings, or as he called them, 4 chords. We have that same kind of gourd back, or that gourd rim. We've got the same kind of animal skin head, but we've got some interesting American and European adaptations to the instrument as well. If you look closely, it looks like he's got on the headstock some European violin style tuners. And instead of the neck being a stick like you'd have on the Akonting, you can tell that the neck is actually flat like you'd see on a lot more European style instruments. Now, I tried to build a replica of this just to see how it would play and what it would sound like compared to the Akonting and compared to the banjo, kind of as the missing link between the two. And I can tell you, trying to get the action to play on this, you can see the action, if you can see my camera, is very high off of the fretboard, which is also similar to the Akonting. But the playing style is going to be very similar. And you can see that, the evidence in the picture, and you can tell from Thomas Jefferson's writing a little bit about how this is going to be played. So that provides us a little bit of a transition between the Akonting and the American banjo, but you'll notice there's still some things missing. For example, most modern day banjos now, if you're looking at Clawhammer, have 5 strings on them. So where does that 5th string come from? Well, that's credited to this guy, a guy named Joel Walker Sweeney. Now, what he did is he wandered around central Virginia. He was from Appomattox, and if you're familiar with American history, that's the same town that the Civil War is going to come to an end when when Lee surrenders to Grant in Appomattox Courthouse, 1865. Same area. This guy actually dies 5 years before the Civil War ends, so he wasn't around to see that. But what he claimed to do is he wandered around central Virginia and learned how to play the banjo from enslaved people. And he said that he noticed a lot of the banjos had this 5th string, and we're not talking about the high string. We're not talking about the high short 5th string. We're talking about an additional bass string. So he added an additional bass string, and people say that he possibly took a cheese box instead of a gourd and tied those 5 strings onto it, giving us what we call the minstrel banjo or minstrel style banjo. And from this point, he ended up doing a lot of blackface minstrel shows, touring all the way to Europe, inspiring people like Daniel Decatur Emmett, who wrote things like Dixie, who was ironically something that Abraham Lincoln really loved as well. But kind of started this a little bit racist, not a little bit, a lot racist popularization of the banjo in America. And again, he gets a lot of credit, but possibly also a lot of shame for his role in popularizing the banjo and the way that he popularized it. But either way, if we look at the progression that we've got at this point, we've got the Akonting, which I don't want to say is a historical instrument necessarily, because clearly people in Senegal still play it as it is. But we've got the Akonting, and then when enslaved Africans arrived in America, you can see them taking the ideas of the Akonting and applying them to American-made materials, American-grown materials, gourds from America, animal skins from America. Instead of goat, they're using a lot of cow skin at this point in history. So you can see some changes there. Then you've got the minstrel banjo of the 1830s and 40s that Joel Walker Sweeney brings us, adding in that 5th string. And then, of course, what most of us are going to have in our hands now is going to be a banjo that became a little bit more prevalent around the 1880s. And that banjo, of course, is going to be your more modern style clawhammer banjo with the addition of the frets, either violin or geared tuners. And what's really special and interesting about that is what we basically have in our hands is an African instrument that has been adapted by European players and made of American materials, which kind of makes the modern day clawhammer open back banjo analogous to American history and analogous to the cultural harmony that exists within the United States. Now, that said, I would be remiss to not acknowledge something that I think probably all of us are thinking in the back of our minds at this point, and that is that we owe a tremendous debt to enslaved Africans for bringing, in quotation, this instrument to us. And as banjo players, musicians, and Americans, it would be wrong of us to ignore the racist past that the banjo in America represents. However, the banjo is not only an important symbol of America's controversial past, but it's also a symbol of the beauty of what happens when European Americans and African Americans can come together and learn from one another, creating something unique and special in the world. So there's my soapbox moment with all the current events that are going on. I'll leave it at that. But at this point, let's go back to grabbing our banjo. So grab your banjo if you put it down, and we're going to go to a new tuning. And this is kind of based on where we should probably go from here with our clawhammer playing based on what we've learned about the history of the instrument. So we've seen in the history of clawhammer banjo, most of the melody on the original instrument, on the original Akonting, is played just on the first string. We've also learned from the videos that we saw of the Akonting that there's lots of syncopation. But I want to introduce you to possibly a new tuning. A lot of people call this Sandy River Belle tuning. It's a tuning that I learned from Adam Hurt when he did a workshop here in Albuquerque several years ago. And for Sandy River Belle tuning, what you want to do is you want to tune your banjo similar to sawmill tuning, if you're familiar with that, where you're going to take your low C, if you were tuned to double C, and you're going to tune it back up to D, which is similar to what you would have if you're playing it in open G. And then you're going to drop your high fifth string. And I'm going to scoot back so you can kind of see my hands here as well. You're going to drop your high fifth string actually down to an F. Now this is going to mimic the tuning of the Akonting pretty well in a few ways. First of all, if you remember, the Akonting has in its tuning a 1 for the root, but also a 5 and a 7. And that 7 is definitely something that's a little bit different and a little bit unique to the Akonting. And I think it's been fun to throw it back into the tuning of the banjo for the historical purposes, for the sound. It adds a really cool kind of dark, haunting element to it. But with this tuning, you also have the addition of a C as your fourth note in the tuning. So when you play this all together, you have that kind of sound, which again mimics the Akonting pretty well. And if you think about playing something that has a lot of melody just on the first string, you come up with something like this. And this is just a little piece of a song for a piece that I wrote in a song called Rainy Day for the Kipsies. We're playing at 2 o'clock on the Sandia stage, and this is actually the song that we start out with just because it's one of my favorites, and it's got that historical tradition of the banjo being played more like an Akonting with a lot of the melody on the first string. And it sounds a little bit like this. If you want to hear the rest of the song, you'll have to go to our performance at 2 o'clock on the Sandia stage. So there's my double plug for you. But either way, at this point in your playing, I would strongly encourage you to play along and play around with this tuning because there's a lot that you can do with it, and it really opens up a lot of possibilities, a lot of melodic possibilities playing on that first string. And it also eliminates a lot of that, the comment that you probably get, I get it all the time, that's the banjo is just such a happy, jangly instrument. Well, depends on how you're playing, of course, and it depends on your tuning. And this traditional tuning really opens up to a lot of interesting tonal possibilities. Now, if we apply this to a traditional tune that's typically in sawmill, something that a lot of people are familiar with, this is Cluck Old Hen, and play this tuning, this Sandy River Belle tuning on this song, you get something a little bit darker, a little bit more interesting. So I put a real basic tab up on your screen. Feel free to play along, and you'll notice it doesn't have a lot of where the fifth string is played, so you're going to have to infer based on the melody and based on whether or not you've played this song before. But notice the tuning is going to be different. Applying that Sandy River Belle tuning once again, dropping that G from your fifth string down to an F, down that whole step. And when you do that, Cluck Old Hen takes on a whole new cool tonal sound to it. Let's check it out. So it really darkens it up and puts it in a really nice tonal place. There's a lot of different tunes that you can do this with as well. Really, any song that you've played in that modal tuning, you can apply to the Sandy River Belle Akonting style tuning as well. One thing that I've really loved lately is playing the song Frosty Morning, if you're familiar with that one, with this tuning. It really makes it sound really nice and really clean. So that would be my encouragement to you is try to play along with your different songs in this tuning and just see what happens, but also just play around with that melody. Remember, banjo players are notorious noodlers. Noodle around on your first string and just see what kind of new melodies emerge for you as you're playing along. I do want to acknowledge a couple quick references. The Banjo, America's African Instrument by Laurent Dubois has been an amazing resource for me as I've been engaging and learning more about the banjo. When I traveled to Africa and collected my Akonting out there in Senegal, reading his book and seeing what was going on in Senegal was mind-blowing. He's spot on accurate. Belle Flex Throw Down Your Heart video is an amazing resource. Wayne Shrubsaw, who I know most of you know, is a local banjo hero. Bill Evans, who just recently moved to Alto, New Mexico, also a great banjo historian. And Rhiannon Giddens from the Carolina Chocolate Drops. Check out some of her YouTube videos. She talks a lot about the history of the banjo, especially in the minstrel era, and has a lot of good resources. At this point, we just have a couple more minutes, so I want to get back to see what kind of questions anybody may have had. So let me stop sharing my screen and pull up the chat. Cool. I'm going to scroll through and see what we got.
Randy, I think I saw a question from Peter Garrity regarding how many strings were on the Akonting.
Okay, sure. So the Akonting has three strings on it, with the tuning being that, again, that 1, 5, and 7. And they're just tied on, literally just wrapped around the neck multiple times and tied on with a special knot that I haven't figured out how to tie myself, so I got to make sure I don't break these strings. But just tied on, and then to tune it, you just kind of wiggle that knot up and down on the stick so you get it in the tune that you want. And it actually works out pretty well. So 3 strings on the Akonting. Is any other quick questions? I see one of my students at Desert Ridge. Hey, Jess. Hope you enjoyed the presentation. Any other questions?
People are raving about you in this chat room. I just want to make sure you know that everybody's raving about how wonderful this is.
Oh, good. I hope it was something new, something a little bit different. So, all right. Well, if there's no other questions, I want to make sure that we transition over to our next workshop. So, again, explain the sheet music of Cluck Old Hen. I'm going to post this whole presentation on the Kipsies Facebook page. Notice my little plug there again to get you over to our Facebook page. I'm going to post it on our Facebook page so you can access that tab. So the sheet music is called Tab, and there's a lot of videos. I don't want to take up too much time talking about it. There's a lot of videos and a lot of resources online to learn how to read Tab if that's something that's new to you. Much more simple than musical notation, I promise.
Andy, tell us one more time, you're playing on the Sandia stage at 2 p.m. today, the Kipsies?
Correct. Yeah, so my band
Awesome.
is the Kipsies. I'll be doing, out of the 8 songs that we're playing, 3 of them are going to be in that Sandy River Belle Akonting style tuning, and you'll definitely hear that tone when we're playing those songs. So, yeah, come check us out, 2 o'clock Sandia stage on the Facebook for the Folk Festival.